Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 12th week of 2015. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established 13 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East. Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and control of them gives the U.S. an advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. Now, after 13 years of war, President Obama, who was elected to end George Bush's wars, is waging war in 8 countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and even the Philippines. Many Americans are unaware that he's conducting the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, a secret series of murders by drone whereby he's already killed thousands of people, including hundreds of children. They're also aware that he is bombing ISIS. Many Americans are not aware that he is bombing ISIS in Iraq and Syria in violation of the United Nations Charter, which forbids the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state without the authorization of the UN Security Council. And that he's recklessly provoking war with Russia and Ukraine, where a U.S. proxy government has already killed thousands, to eviscerate the Russian economy and help the American 1% profit from disorder in Eurasia. Also, most Americans don't know that U.S. Special Forces, death squads like American Sniper, are active in more than 100 countries around the world. Their activities include kidnapping, which we call rendition, torture, and murder. Americans don't know, but the rest of the world does, and we're hated for it. Champaign-Urbana AWARE recommends that you contact the President and our representatives in Congress and tell them to stop killing people around the world and to bring all U.S. troops home. The AWARE webpage and Facebook page have email addresses and phone numbers for President Obama, Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Mark Kirk, and Representative Rodney Davis. 13 years of nonstop U.S. war-making is more than enough. And of course, it didn't begin with 9/11. But the administration that promised hope and change in the war and the economy has dashed hopes and produced no change, except to expand the war. The Obama administrations are today committing murder around the world, but pretending that they aren't, in order to mislead the only enemy they really fear, the American people, who drove 2 presidents from office during the Vietnam War. And the government is helped in this deception by a compliant, big business-run media, so Americans know far less about what's going on than citizens of other countries. Tonight we'll try to give a better account with commentaries by Ron Zoke, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, and I'll be back with a comment on the local academy. We'll start with Ron Zoke, going rogue. I don't think he's referring to his hat, but he might be.
Well, I'm always slightly deviant to wearing my silly hats, but anyway, there are a number of points that I want to hit upon very briefly and see if I can provoke my colleagues here into further comments.
More than the hat does.
Yeah, right. So one question this week is a kind of perennial question, actually, is what to do about all those countries that are not submitting to American leadership. And we hear a lot about leadership from our supposed national leader and the obligation of us to impose our leadership on the rest of the world and what to do about those nations that are groups that refuse to submit to it. So who are the rogue states then that are in this group? Some writers, again, typically leftist deviants, have identified the USA itself and Israel as rogue states. But apparently somewhere in Washington there's a semi-official list of rogue states, again being the ones that don't meet certain criteria, such as saying only nice things about the USA. There's another list, which is official, I guess, state sponsors of terrorism. And currently on the list are Cuba, curiously enough, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria. These are officially designated as state sponsors of terrorism, and that creates certain kinds of treatment legally and militarily and so on. The former list was Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Serbia and Montenegro. So how does one get on the list of state sponsors of terrorism? Well, it's a little vague, but anyway, there are certain places that will never get on it, and those being the USA, of course, and of Israel, no matter what we do. So what we have instead is a list of those people who are to be killed over the next week, if possible. The American Civil Liberties Union has demanded from the White House a list of the criteria that are being used to add people to the list of those who are going to be killed by drones or by American assassination squads or whatever. The exception, again, is always, of course, the USA and the people who say nice things about us. So there are a number of other points here that deserve to be mentioned today, I think. This is the 12th anniversary of the killing of Rachel Corrie, who was crushed by an armored Israeli bulldozer 12 years ago. And you can find some amusing stuff online. Members, for example, of the Israeli army, the IDF, having great fun with Rachel Corrie pancakes, alluding to the fact that she was flattened, smashed, and so on. So take a look at it. It's,
why? I'm sorry. Why would I want to look at something like that?
Yeah. Some people don't want to look at unpleasant
She's
things,
a hero.
but I think it's good discipline sometimes.
Political attitudes of the America's chief client in the region, and I mean, we're responsible for what they're doing.
Yeah. So more points this week. It's officially Sunshine Week. Access to public information is supposed to be encouraged and protected, but the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, that we often see alluded to, has not been very effective in getting governmental units, local to national, to release information about what they've been doing. This is also, by the way, Wildlife Week, so if you had any wildlife recently, tell us about it. Anyway, a local agency of the state, the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, was asked to provide emails and documentation concerning the Salida case, and they refused, saying that it was unduly burdensome to do this. So I wonder if other people have the privilege of doing that, saying, sorry, I won't do it because it's unduly burdensome for me to provide all those documents. Excuse me. So that should be provocative enough to get you started, people. And so there, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Ron. You're listening to, you're watching Aware on the Air, and we'll go to Michael Bay for some comments.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on the EU military force that Germany intends to build up. I'm referring and partially reading from an article by Madi Darius Natse Morovia. An EU military force is being justified as protection from Russia, but it may also be of reducing US influence as the EU and Germany come to loggerheads with the US and NATO over Ukraine. While speaking to the German newspaper Welt am Sonntag, European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker announced the time has come for the creation of a unified EU military force. Juncker used rhetoric questions about defending the values of the European Union and nuanced anti-Russian polemics to promote the creation of a European army, which would convey a message to Moscow. The polemics and arguments for an EU army may be based around Russia, but the idea is really directed against the US. The underlying story here is the tensions that are developing between the US on the one side and the EU and Germany on the other side. This is why Germany reacted enthusiastically to the proposal, pushing its support behind a joint EU armed force. The German Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen said, "Such intertwining of the militaries with an eye to establishing a European army is a very viable idea that looks to the future." The EU and Germans realize that there is not much that they can do to hamper Washington as long as it has a say in EU and European security. Both Berlin and a cross-section of the EU have been resentful of how Washington is using NATO to advance its interests and to influence the events inside Europe. If not a form of pressure in behind-the-door negotiations with Washington, the calls for an EU military are designed to reduce Washington's influence in Europe and possibly make NATO defunct. An EU army that would cancel out NATO would have a strategic cost for the US. In this context, Washington would lose its western perch in Eurasia. It would automatically spell the end of America's participation in the game on the Eurasian chessboard, in the words of former US National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski. The intelligentsias in the US are already alarmed at the risks that an EU military would pose to American influence. The American Jewish Committee's influential Commentary magazine, which is affiliated to the neocons in the Washington Beltway, has asked, as the title of the article by Seth Mandel illustrates, "Why is Germany undermining NATO?" This is while the Washington Examiner has asked, as the title of the article by Hoskinson says, "Whatever happened to US influence?" This is why Washington's vassals in the EU, specifically Britain, Poland, and the three Baltic states, have all been very vocal in their opposition to the idea of a common EU military force. While Paris has been reluctant to join the calls for an EU army, French opposition politician Marine Le Pen has announced that the time has come for France to come out of the shadow of the United States. British Prime Minister David Cameron's government responded to Jean-Claude Juncker by slamming his idea as an outrageous fantasy, declaring that the military is a national responsibility and not an EU responsibility. Poland and Latvia also reacted skeptically towards the proposal. These statements all serve US interests in preserving NATO as a tool for its influence in Europe and Eurasia. There are some very important questions here. If the EU military is a response to the US initiation of the Ukraine conflict and the continuous destabilization in Eurasia, it remains questionable how long peace can be maintained between European countries like Germany or other countries supporting the EU military force, and how straight we are heading for a third world war.
That is unfortunately true. Thank you very much, Michael. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Karen Aram.
Well, I'm very interested in continuing this conversation with Michael. I have some questions to ask, but I was prepared to read from an article that was done in August 2012 by Glenn Greenwald in The Guardian, and the title was "Human Rights Critics of Russia and Ecuador Parade Their Own Hypocrisy." And he deals here, I'm not going to talk about Ecuador, I'm not going to talk about Pussy Riot, which I'm not a fan of, neither was Glenn Greenwald, and he discusses that at length. But there were things in this article I thought were of interest because I had just recently seen some comments made about Noam Chomsky, and who I revere, as to why is Noam Chomsky, he hates America. He's always talking about all these bad things, you know, that America's doing, and look at all the bad things that all these other nations are doing, and end our support, along with our support for dissidents. And there's one statement here that is, somebody made a comment on, as that, and just like in the bad old days, such knee-jerk yet selective support for Russian dissidents without fully engaging with their ideas is not only hypocritical, but also does a great disservice to their cause. And this is one of the things that I think really needs to be emphasized. Now, a former Soviet dissident and current member of the anti-Putin opposition, Eduard Limonov, knows such criticism too well, knows such cynicism too well. Thrown out of the Soviet Union and welcomed in New York as a Cold War trophy, Limonov soon learned that it wasn't the dissent part that the United States loved about Soviet dissidents, but their anti-communism. A bristly and provocative anti-Soviet leftist, he got to work doing what he did best, taking on the establishment, and quickly found himself in hot water again, this time with the Americans. Limonov concluded that the FBI is just as zealous in putting down American radicals as the KGB is with its own radicals and dissidents. Now, does anyone really think that an American media that stands by complacently while excessive force and mass arrest are unleashed on the far more peaceful Occupy movement, or which says nothing about the systematic prosecution of American Muslims for core free speech activities, possesses some sort of genuine concern for free speech and free assembly rights in Russia? Now, to quote Noam Chomsky, Noam Chomsky put it best. Well, first let me quote Glenn Greenwald saying that fixating on the rights abuses of distant governments while largely ignoring those committed by one's own does not only demonstrate the glaring insincerity of the purported beliefs. Far worse, it's an abdication of one's primary duty as a journalist and as a citizen to oppose, first and foremost, the bad acts of one's own government. And Noam Chomsky put this best when asked why he spends the bulk of his time on the crimes of his own government and its client states, rather than on America's enemies. And Noam said, "My own concern is primarily the terror and violence carried out by my own state for two reasons. For one thing, because it happens to be a larger component of international violence, but also for a much more important reason than that, namely, I can do something about it. So even if the U.S. was responsible for only 2% of the violence in the world instead of the majority of it, it would be that 2% I would be primarily responsible for. And that is a simple ethical judgment. That is, the ethical value of one's actions depends on their anticipated and predictable consequences. It is very easy to denounce the atrocities of someone else. That has about as much ethical value as denouncing atrocities that took place in the 18th century." I have one more point here to mention regarding our pivot to Asia. The latest U.S. Maritime Strategic Document, A Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power, Forward, Engaged, Ready. Now, this was released just a couple days ago, on the 13th to be exact. It's known as CS21R. I repeat that, CS21R. It's the first update since 2007, and it reveals plans to rebalance 60% of its naval and air force to the Indo-Pacific region by 2020. So when we talk about the pivot to Asia, we're not just talking, okay? And I will go into that article further another time because I think we have enough here to discuss today. So I'll move on.
Thank you, Karen. That is indeed very important. The actual military moves by the Bush administration, that's the problem. It is the extension of the Bush administration. By the Obama administration, the actual military moves in terms of updating nuclear weapons, the military transformations that you just mentioned, all of this going on sort of under the radar. Some cases literally, I suppose. But I mean, it's the settled policy of the Obama administration is being put into effect in expanding these war capabilities, this war-making situation, without much discussion. This is very dangerous indeed. David Johnson has some comments, I think.
Yes, I guess mine's going to be pretty short today. It's just everyone knows that today is St. Patrick's Day, and just want to state that St. Patrick's Day should be more than just getting drunk and eating corned beef and cabbage?
Right.
Yes, it's there's a lot to be learned from the struggle in historically in Ireland as well as in America. A lot of the same things that the 1%, both in the past in Ireland and in the U.S. Have done, is being basically done today as well. I mean, you look at a lot of the things that happened shortly after the invasion of Iraq, very, very similar to what the British did in Northern Ireland. As far as trying to promote sectarian violence amongst various groups, the ones that they're trying to control, to false flag bombings, trying to blame it on the opposition, to hoodings and kidnappings of political dissidents and putting them in solitary confinement and even torturing them, and even to the point of where they actually even detained dissidents' families. We're talking about the British in Ireland traditionally as late as the 1990s, actually, and what they did in Iraq after the invasion. I mean, very similar thing. Death squads, you name it. So just if you'd like to do more than just get drunk and eat corned beef and cabbage today, check out a little Irish history. In particular, check out two notable figures, one James Connolly, and the other one, a person who's still alive, Bernadette Devlin. That's pretty much all I have to say on that. I am looking forward, though, to the commentary.
I'll pick up the reference to Connolly. James Connolly, of course, was an Irishman. He was born in Scotland, but his family was Irish. He lived and worked in the United States for a while, associated with the IWW and the Labour Party, and a founder, really, of the Labour Party in Ireland. He was the leader, one of the principal leaders of the Irish Rising, the Easter Rebellion in 1916, and he was so badly wounded when the British retook the Central Post Office that in order to execute him, the British had to tie him to a chair so that he could be shot. The outrage, both in Ireland and even in England and Scotland, over the treatment of the rebels was great enough to produce the continuation of the rising against the English occupation of Ireland, the British occupation of Ireland, which has really come to an end, so to speak, only in our own time. But Connolly, as I say, is particularly worthwhile remembering because he was a political and social commentator of great power. Very important things to say about the politics of the labor movement of his time and of international politics. In 1915, he wrote an article opposing conscription of Irish citizens to fight in the war in Europe and to oppose the war himself. He was one of the few members of the Second International who actually opposed the war, the First World War, the war against Germany, in 1914. In 1915, his article on conscription included the following paragraph: "One great source of the strength of the ruling class has ever been their willingness to kill in defense of their power and privileges. Let their power be once attacked either by foreign foes or domestic revolutionists, and at once we see the rulers prepared to kill and kill and kill. The readiness of the ruling class to order killing, the small value the ruling class has ever set upon human life, is in marked contrast to the reluctance of all revolutionists to shed blood. And as we read about, or rather we don't read about, Obama's drone campaign, which has killed literally thousands of people, and is unknown to most Americans, we can see that Connolly's observation remains very much in force today, I'm sorry to say. Comments? Yes, Karen, go ahead.
Well, on James Connolly, I was reading up on him since David's program on Sunday. And one of the things that I noted was that he did not wish to be referred to as a nationalist. He was not. He was a Marxist. And that's very important, especially if you understand Irish history and what the nationalists stood for. But I won't go into that now. And my outrage over Ron's provocation regarding Rachel Corrie is due to the fact that it raises pretty sickening images in my mind that of such psychopaths that would be posting such things about somebody who really was a hero. And if anybody questions what a tank will do to a body, there are films out there that portray it very well as books. And again, part of the horrors of war. But my real question here, I would like Michael to just discuss a little bit more because about the militarization of Germany, as well as their I mean, doing away with NATO sounds like a really good thing to me right now, given that NATO is so provocative on Russia's borders and dangerous. They're both having nuclear weapons, and I like to think that Germany and France would move away, the whole EU would move away from that. But then when you're referring to the build-up of military nations,
Correct.
in and of itself, what that leads to, it gets pretty powerfully frightening, especially when you know what Brzezinski has been saying about it. So maybe more people here could talk about that.
Yeah, the militarization is a clear response to the United States policies and engagements in this conflict. It's increasingly creating a conflict not only between the West and the East, between the NATO and Russia, but also between European nations and the United States, and that's something that may become very risky in the near future.
It's interesting to look at the recent history of NATO. By recent, I mean in the last couple of American administrations, particularly the Democratic administrations, where NATO has been used as a way to get around certain aspects of international law that trammels up the military activities that the U.S. government wishes to engage in. This became clear in the Clinton administration when the attempt was made to reduce Serbia, which was not playing by the rules that the U.S. wanted to set up for the economic for its economic domination of Europe, NATO was essentially moribund by the 1990s. NATO had been set up, of course, to as a American propaganda enterprise after the Second World War, under the threat of a Russian invasion of the United States. NATO was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was to stop the Russian hordes from rushing across the Atlantic and seizing the United States. I mean, it was all nonsense, of course. I mean, the Russian army, which we never quite admitted, was what had defeated Nazi Germany. The Russian army was exhausted by that enterprise at the end of the war, was not in a position to seize anybody at the end of the Second World War or the generation afterwards. But the U.S. used the threat of Russia in order to build up its own military control of the world that it had essentially inherited from the Second World War. Well, Well, that was gone. I mean, the Soviet Union had disappeared in the 1990s, and NATO was still hanging around, defending Connecticut against the Russians, I suppose. The Clinton people had the wonderful idea that they could use NATO to go around the United Nations. If there really was a military problem over Kosovo and the former Yugoslavia, international law was absolutely clear about it. It should go to the United Nations. The United Nations Security Council should consider the matter and decide what was to be done about it. Well, the U.S. didn't want to do that because, of course, the Security Council would not have authorized an American assault on Serbia, which was what the Clinton administration wanted to do. So they called on NATO. They dusted off NATO. They woke up the NATO officials, you know, and said, hey, you guys, we need you. We want you to authorize the American attack on Serbia, which NATO did because, after all, the U.S. was running the NATO military operation, even in its desuetude. So we got a nice little war out of that, killed a mess of people in Southeast Europe, and set the great American military base Bondsteel in the middle of Kosovo, which we use for Middle Eastern activities. Now, NATO revived suddenly became a vehicle for the U.S. press into Eurasia that Karen was referring to. We now have this NATO presence in Europe that, as Michael described, is making the Europeans a good bit uncomfortable, as well it might. The American official in charge of the NATO forces is a man named Breedlove, which, Pepe Escobar and others have said, you know, sounds an awful lot like
Strangelove.
Dr. Strangelove from the Stanley Kubrick movie. And here, once again, we have reality in its boring, predictable fashion imitating art, and war being set up through this operation. Well, as Michael describes, the Europeans are not quite ready to roll over and take this as they have for a generation and more. They're really a little restless under this arrangement. And the best example we have of that is the rush to join this Asian Development Bank that China has set up. I think, in fact, they were actually surprised in Washington that Britain, Germany, and France all rushed to join this alternative to the IMF, the World Bank, that China is establishing right now. That's really a surprise, and something that probably would not have happened a couple of years ago, except for this move towards independence that you heard about before. So military issues, economic issues are bound up here quite tightly, and what they're actually doing is upsetting our rulers in Washington, who are saying, you know, in the words of Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State, this is television, copulate the Europeans. That's the view in Washington, and this is what we're dealing with.
I was going to comment on that a little further. When I was with the Asian Development Bank, the U.S. and Japan were the major loaners, okay? And China and India were the major borrowers. So when you think about how this new Asian Development Bank is being set up, what are we calling it again? The new BRICS Development Bank? What do we call it?
AIIB, Asian.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, the new one,
we'll
the new one that will be competing with ADB. The lenders will be many of some of these BRIC nations, but I wanted to make another comment again in respect to Asia. Last week, I think I mentioned that the president of Sri Lanka, may have been the prime minister, I've forgotten, paid his ubiquitous trip to India to meet with them, to assure them that they wanted better relations with India, and that this is in keeping with their pulling away from China and going towards the U.S. And that was why he was actually elected, because he was our boy, as we say. On this topic, though, they have stopped, Sri Lanka has stopped construction of the port in Sri Lanka, which was being done with China, China is losing something like $350,000 a day, as well as having at least 1,000 people unemployed as a result. But it's being reevaluated, is what they're saying, under a legal government document. But then it's mentioned that the same president is then going, or maybe it's the foreign minister of Sri Lanka, he's going at the end of May, he's going to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping with his hands out to borrow money because they need the money, okay? So it puts us in this really, like, how can you do that? So he is walking a real balancing act, and this is what I see throughout Asia. They're walking a lot of the leaders are walking a fine balancing act between Asia, between China, and between the U.S. And so when I hear what Michael was reporting today, that's something that it hadn't even occurred to me, that nations who are not happy with what we're doing with NATO up against Russia are turning into perhaps some of U.S. enemies as a result of our provocations. So it's pretty frightening what we're looking at.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think NATO has been dusted off twice. The original vision was not, I thought, a transatlantic invasion, but the horror show of thousands of Soviet tanks rolling westward across Europe.
Into Paris, exactly.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
you're quite right. It was heightened for Americans. The whole notion was that we had to go back on a war footing because of the Russian threat. That's what we were sold. I mean, it was quite cynical in the Truman administration. Who was it? Senator Vandenberg, who said to Truman, "Look, the only way you're going to get your programs passed is if you scare hell out of the American people." And that was reported at the time, and that's exactly what the Truman administration did. This is in the late 40s, and the purpose of NATO was essentially to jumpstart the American economy by a new war scare. American elites knew very well at the end of the war that the only thing that had solved the Depression in America was the war, and that American war production produced employment and so forth that brought the Great Depression in America to an end. And the great fear when the Second World War ended in America was that the Depression would come back, because after all, the war was over, and therefore they had to gin up a new war, the equivalent of war, in order to keep the American economy rolling the way that it had in the early 40s. And that was the Russian threat. NATO was the new army that would stop the new threat coming from Europe. Yeah, that was, it was quite cynically done. I mean, American planners knew what they were doing, but it was sold to the American people on the grounds that it's defending us against the Russian threat. And of course, once the Russian nuclear bombs were in place, it was much easier to sell that to Americans. And we went through a generation, a Cold War generation, in which American policy was based upon these lies to the American people.
To meet the supposed threat of the Soviet tanks rolling into Western Europe, we started building a lot of tanks of our own. I understand that's still going on. It's become highly implausible that those tanks will ever be used in actual combat or warfare. But the gimmick is they're built in Ohio, in the congressional district of one especially active congressman who keeps saying that a lot of jobs will be lost if we shut this thing down. So there's still more of them being produced every day. They're stored in a vast parking lot, I understand, in California somewhere. And there's no prospect, the military analysts say, that all these tanks will ever be used again. But it goes on because there are still people getting paid to do their jobs and producing all these tanks. And so we're caught in that.
But American propagandists have learned nothing and forgotten nothing here. I mean, we're told now about how Russia is massing all its arms along the Ukrainian border. I mean, what are we going to do? We're going to send the Ukrainians tanks so they can hold off those Russian tanks. Yeah. I mean, if you hear an echo in here, it's not an accident.
I heard something, sorry, on Democracy Now! I think it was yesterday. Amy Goodman was interviewing Bill McKibben of 350.org, and they were talking about Cyclone Pam, who just devastated, wanted to, if I'm saying that island's name right, but I think over 4 million people have been left homeless. 30 people were killed. Over 4 million people, which is over half the population of that island. And one of the things he was talking about, we won't get into all the other islands and some of the politics there, I'll leave that for another time, but one of the things he was talking about was how the cost of solar power has actually gone down, that we should be able to all afford solar panels. And if we could only get behind this, and I mean, bottom line, if we would stop building military weapons and start focusing industry, we could put a lot more people to work if we started focusing on renewable energy. So that's how it's related.
You've got to remember that as the American economy is structured, there is finally not much of a push to put people to work, except, of course, from the people who are out of work and would like jobs. But the economy as a whole, the commanding heights of the economy are controlled, as we know, by the owners, by the boardrooms in New York and so forth, where the directors of major American corporations decide how the wealth of the country should be spent, primarily to produce more wealth for them, but in terms of making the industrial system run, how you're going to do that. And these people do not have a great interest in full employment. What happens if you have full employment? Well, all those people who are employed begin to say, look, you need us, we'd like to be paid better, paid consistently with the sorts of wages that Americans got after the Second World War, for example. If they had continued along the same line, we would not have flat wages in this country for 40 years. Now, the only way you ensure that workers do not demand ongoing wage rises is make sure that there's a reserve army of the unemployed. A group of people out there who want those jobs and will take them if the people who presently have them say they're not being paid enough and move away. So the unemployment situation in America is not an accident. It's an artifact. It's a feature, not a bug. And we're not going to change that until we demand government action that produces jobs for people who need them. That's what happened, of course, at the depths of the Depression. That's what happened with the WPA, the Works Progress Administration in the Roosevelt administration, but that was vigorously opposed by American industry because of the effect it would have on wages. If you're an employer, you don't want to have that sort of effect on wages. That hasn't changed. You're watching Aware on the Air. Other comments?
Yes, Carl. I think this also applies to austerity in general.
Exactly.
The policy of the United States, and also some of the other I should say loner countries like Britain and Germany. Is that the capitalists of both the United States and these other countries, they want to push standards of living down so far that people are willing to fight over a $3 an hour job,
right.
That they won't have any health care, that they won't have any retirement security. They want people to be desperate and frightened. And this all fits into the whole agenda of the American ruling class and also the European ruling class. And then, Michael, I wanted to ask a question. It seems as if, besides the grander strategy that Brzezinski, of course, is always fond of controlling the world chessboard through Eurasia and the necessity of checking Russia, if you will, to where it won't get in its way. And it's really about the only country other than China that could really pose a serious threat to the United States. Do you think part of all this tension, starting with the coup in Ukraine that was backed by the United States and actually orchestrated and financed, and now this military buildup in Ukraine, do you think part of the reason this is to decouple economic activity between Russia and the European Union?
Decouple economic relations between Russia and the European Union. Partially, yes. Of course, all this destabilization that is initiated by the United States deals or contributes to destabilizing the economy, and that's one of the goals in order to maintain the US primary position in the world, not only economically, but also militarily and in general internationally. But also it serves on destabilizing relations, destabilizing the development of the European Union, kind of how would you say it? Destroying the unity. You see that countries are commenting differently with regard to the initiation or to the construction of a EU military force. The European Union increasingly gets separated from a common goal, and that's what triggers. If you separate your enemies, you yourself gain strength. So that's what I see as the primary
That's exactly right.
development.
Yes. You're watching Aware on the Air. We have a few minutes left. I have a comment about the Iranian situation and what the U.S. is doing in regard to Iran. We saw the beleaguered Prime Minister of Israel come to Congress and warn the president against a dangerous deal with the Iranians, and most of us realize it had much more to do with the upcoming election, the elections that are going on right now in Israel, than anything else, although it did recapitulate another set of lies about American foreign policy, this in the Middle East and this in regard to Iran. The liars on these matters are frequently in the American Academy, in the university system. We had a particularly egregious example of this last Sunday in the News-Gazette, where Professor Ed Colliget, a political scientist at the ethically challenged little university down the street, had an article about the Iranian situation. The article was entitled, "Iran Treaty Would Be a Step Forward." It was ostensibly in support of the Obama administration's activities in the Middle East. To paraphrase Casablanca, Professor Colliget is one of the reasons political science enjoys the reputation it has today. After urging us in this article that facts should be kept in mind, that's how he starts it, he begins with the Netanyahu-like lie that an Iran with nuclear weapons would constitute a threat to the existence of Israel. Well, Israel, in fact, has hundreds of nuclear weapons and has accurately been called a stationary aircraft carrier for the U.S. government's thousands of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. We heard a far more accurate assessment than from Professor Colliget on Democracy Now! Last week. For Prime Minister Netanyahu and the hawks in Congress, mostly Republican, the primary goal is to undermine any potential negotiation that might settle whatever issue there is with Iran. They have a common interest in ensuring that there is no regional force, that is in the Middle East, that can serve as any kind of deterrent to Israeli and U.S. violence, the major violence in the region. Iran's general strategic posture is one of deterrence. They have low military expenditures, and according to U.S. intelligence, their strategic doctrine is to try to prevent an attack, the sort of attack that Netanyahu was threatening, up to the point where diplomacy can set in. I don't think anyone with a gray cell functioning thinks that they would ever conceivably use a nuclear weapon, the Iranians, or even try to. The country would be obliterated in 15 seconds. But they might provide a single nuclear weapon might provide a deterrent of sorts. And the U.S. and Israel certainly don't want to tolerate that sort of deterrence. They are the forces that carry out regular violence and aggression in the region, and they don't want any impediment to that, which is what an Iranian nuclear bomb would be. Furthermore, U.S. negotiations with Iran aren't really concerned with Iran's non-existent nukes, or even with Israel's quite existent ones. What the Obama administration is trying to do, and what really upsets the Israeli government, who know that the nuclear weapons issue is a made-up issue, what the Obama administration is really trying to do is to reincorporate oil-rich Iran into the American system of control of Mideast energy resources. During the Second World War, when the U.S. was taking over, the State Department said of Mideast oil, quote, "It's a stupendous source of strategic power and the greatest material prize in world history." That's the attitude of the American government since the Second World War. But control, and not just access to Middle East oil, has been the goal of American policy. At the time of the U.S. invasion in Iraq, Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose name has been taken in vain earlier this evening, the advisor to presidents from Carter to Obama, he pointed out that America's control over the Middle East, I'm quoting here, gives an indirect but politically critical leverage on the European and Asian economies that are also dependent on energy exports from the region. Well, close quote. Control of world energy flows gives the U.S. an unparalleled advantage over its economic rivals in Europe and Asia. The current fall in oil prices has notably hampered the economies of U.S. enemies, Russia and Venezuela. Until the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which removed an American-installed dictator, American control of Mid-East energy resources rested on an effective alliance of 3 U.S. clients: Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran. The Obama-Kerry administration is trying to continue that alliance by reincorporating Iran and weaning it away from the Russian-Chinese Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the sort of Eurasian answer to NATO. Contrary to Professor Colleget's pseudoscientific fantasies, what we're seeing within the U.S. government is dispute on tactics, not strategy, in regard to the Middle East. The strategy is clear. The strategy is to control the Middle East energy resources. The question is how to go about doing it. And we do indeed seem to have a faction fight going on in the American government about whether it should be done by war, by attacking Iran, or whether it should be done by seduction, seducing Iran back into the American control of the Middle East energy situation such as it existed a generation and more ago. That's what the argument is really about. Iranian nuclear weapons are a side note at best, and the Obama administration is perfectly consistent with American practice, American administration practice for the longest time in, first of all, attempting to assure its control by foul means or fair of Middle East energy resources, and secondly, of lying to the American people about what it was actually doing. We have the support, of course, of academics like Professor Colleget. Questions or comments? Are we have a few minutes left?
Yes, I'd like to talk about an upcoming program of Labor's Worldview TV here on UPTV on this coming Sunday from 4 to 5 p.m. We have a special edition, which is Rich Whitney, the past Green Party candidate for governor's talk at the Champaign Public Library this last Saturday. We'll be on Labor's Worldview this Sunday from 4 to 5 p.m. on Urbana Public Television.
As a final note of self-indulgence, my genetic legitimacy for claiming a bit of Irish, as I understand it, that's still very vague to me, but some of my ancestors left Ireland during the Great Potato Famine of the 1840s. They went to Holland and acquired the name Helms. Before that, my mother's name was McGlasson, which is about as Scotch-Irish as you can get, I guess. So those people came from Holland to Virginia, and their name then was the Dutch name, Helms. And these became the mountain people in the Appalachians and the Ozarks and so on, better known as hillbillies. And they're a curious group of people, usually quite poor, bigoted, intensely racist, but still they would like us to think that they have some redeeming qualities.
Were they Catholic or Protestant?
Protestant.
Yeah, and the last name was spelled with an M-A-C?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
That's Scots,
was
yeah.
the name. Yeah.
Usually if it's Irish, it's usually just M-C, like all of my relatives, and they were all Catholic. So that was the Potato Famine group, yeah. Yeah.
Ron, I think you introduced me to a very interesting book a few years ago called Deer Hunting with Jesus, about some of the the ethnic I should say, politics and social phenomena and stuff in Virginia, which I read and found very enlightening.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there was another senator named Helms.
Yeah.
from that
I
area.
was going to ask if you were, if that was
familiar.
that was cousin Jesse, or
Yeah,
not.
right. I've never tried to track that down.
I understand.
Well, I had a grandfather who was a socialist, and so I figure that was the left side of my Irish roots, and they were definitely potato famine people who, yeah.
A parallel to the book you mentioned, David, is the book by Jeffrey Sinclair, the editor of Counterpunch, which we refer to here fairly often. He wrote a thing a couple of years ago called Red State Rebels, in which he looked at these folks that we normally think are part of the non-urban American population and the political fights they're involved in places like Appalachia and the Southwest and so forth. There's a radical tradition in America that is not by any means limited to the coastal liberals, we might say, and that's a tradition that in some ways is really quite important. What is the name of the New York author, Front Porch Republic, Kaufman, who has written about this as well. There's a whole tradition here of American radicalism that we don't know about,
Right.
and should be recalled because there's quite an effort to erase it, and it's no accident that effort is going on. Concluding comments? You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 12th week of 2015. Today is the day that White House aides still call Terror Tuesday, the day each week when President Obama picks out some people to be murdered by drones or U.S. death squads, the Special Operations Command. The president's underlings, notably CIA Director John Brennan, compile a list of who should be executed. Brennan has been absolutely remarkably open about talking about this recently, too. And the president then chooses from baseball cards, which are presented to him by Brennan, who will die. The assassinations are carried out in secrecy. The administration doesn't release accounts of the people they kill, but literally thousands of men, women, and children have been killed on Obama's order. Most Americans don't know that the U.S. is running this terrorist program or that it's continuing. It's thoroughly unconstitutional, of course, and Obama should be impeached for it, but the defense is it's secret. They're not telling you about it. They're not asking you about it. They're not asking permission. They're just doing it.
As I mentioned earlier, the ACLU is going to court trying to get him to release the criteria that are used for adding people to that kill list.
Exactly. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him, also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see our Facebook page on Aware, a Facebook page for Aware, for articles referred to by us on the panel. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't: Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Livy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.